Hello, English learners, and welcome to the Daily English Podcast. I'm your host, Paul. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Excited to chat about English learning today.
Me too.
Yeah.
In my experience, one of the trickiest things about learning English is making that leap from understanding to actually speaking. Have you noticed that too?
Absolutely. It's incredibly common. Many learners find they can read articles, watch movies, maybe even understand a podcast like this one, but when it comes to speaking themselves, it's like hitting a wall.
Exactly. So let's try to break down that wall today. And to start, why do you think this happens? Why is speaking so much harder than understanding?
Well, think about it like learning any new skill. Let's say you want to learn to play the piano.
Okay.
You can listen to beautiful piano music for hours, understand the melody, but that won't magically make your fingers dance across the keys.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So listening and understanding are like observing the skill, but speaking is where we need to train our language muscles, so to speak.
Precisely. And just like with piano, speaking requires practice, building muscle memory, and coordinating a whole bunch of mental processes. Plus, there's the added element of confidence, which we'll get to later.
Okay, so practice is key. Now, one thing I've noticed is that many learners get stuck in the habit of translating everything in their heads. They think in their native language, then try to translate it into English before speaking. What's your take on that?
It's a huge roadblock. Imagine trying to have a smooth conversation while constantly flipping through a dictionary in your mind.
Right,
It just slows everything down.
right. And it can make the spoken English sound unnatural or hesitant. So how can we get out of that translation trap?
One powerful technique is called thinking in English. It sounds simple, but it takes conscious effort.
Thinking in English. So instead of translating, I should try to form my thoughts directly in English.
Exactly. It's like shifting gears in your mind. Instead of seeing English as a code to be deciphered, you start to internalize it as a natural way to express your thoughts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But how do we actually do that? I mean, it's not like I can just flip a switch and start thinking in a different language.
It's definitely a process, but there are some practical steps you can take. One of the most effective is to create an immersive environment, even if you're not living in an English-speaking country.
So surround yourself with English as much as possible.
Exactly. Listen to English music, watch movies or TV shows, read books, even change the language settings on your phone.
So it's about exposing yourself to the rhythm and patterns of the language, almost like training your ear to think in English.
Precisely.
Oh.
And the more you immerse yourself, the less you'll rely on translation. You'll start to notice that English phrases and expressions pop into your head more naturally.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building a mental library of English ready to be used when you need it. But I imagine this takes time and dedication.
It does. But even small steps can make a big difference. Remember, we're building a habit here.
Okay, so consistency is key. Now, besides this thinking in English idea, are there any other common pitfalls that you see learners falling into when it comes to speaking?
One big one is the fear of making mistakes. I think this holds so many people back from actually opening their mouths and practicing.
Oh, absolutely. The fear of sounding silly or saying the wrong thing. I think we've all been there. So how can we help learners overcome that fear?
Well, first, it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes. It's part of the learning process. I mean, even I make mistakes sometimes, and English is my native language.
That's reassuring to hear. But I think it's easy to forget that when you're feeling self-conscious about your speaking.
Absolutely. So the key is to shift your perspective on mistakes. Instead of seeing them as failures, see them as opportunities to learn and grow. Every mistake is a chance to improve your pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary.
So it's like those fail videos we see online, where people laugh at themselves and learn from their mishaps. It's about taking ourselves less seriously and focusing on the learning process.
Exactly. Embrace those mistakes, learn from them, and move on.
Okay, that's great advice.
Yeah.
Now, I know we've talked about practicing speaking and getting over the fear of making mistakes, but are there any specific techniques or exercises that you find particularly helpful for developing speaking fluency?
Oh, absolutely. There are a few techniques that can really boost your speaking skills, and one of my favorites is called shadowing.
Shadowing. I've heard of that, but I'm not entirely sure how it works. Could you tell me more?
It's actually a pretty simple concept. You listen to a native speaker, like someone on a podcast or in a movie, and you try to repeat what they're saying almost simultaneously.
It's like a shadow following the speaker's voice.
Precisely. You're mimicking their pronunciation, intonation, even the rhythm and pacing. It's like a vocal workout for your English.
That sounds interesting. So I could put on my favorite English podcast or TV show and try to talk along with the speaker.
Exactly. It's a fun way to practice your pronunciation, get comfortable with the flow of English, and even pick up new vocabulary and phrases.
I can see how that would be helpful. It's like having a real-time conversation partner, even if it's just with a recording. Do you have any tips for making shadowing more effective?
One tip is to start with short segments. You don't need to shadow an entire movie at once. Choose a scene you like, maybe a minute or two, and focus on that. Then, as you get more comfortable, you can gradually increase the length of the segments.
Okay, so start small and build up gradually. What else?
Another tip is to pay attention to the details. Notice how the speaker pronounces certain words, where they put the stress, and how their intonation changes throughout the sentence.
So it's not just about repeating the words, but really trying to imitate the nuances of their speech.
Exactly. The more you pay attention to those details, the more natural your own spoken English will become.
Wow, this shadowing technique sounds like a really powerful tool. I'm definitely going to give it a try.
I encourage you to. It's a fun and effective way to improve your speaking fluency.
So we've talked about thinking in English, overcoming the fear of making mistakes, and this amazing shadowing technique. What other tips do you have for building speaking confidence? I know practice is important, but are there any specific ways to make that practice more effective?
One of the things I always tell my students is don't underestimate the power of simple, everyday phrases.
You mean things like, hello, how are you, or thank you?
Exactly. These phrases might seem basic, but they're the building blocks of any conversation. And having a solid grasp of these common phrases can make you feel much more confident and comfortable when you're speaking English.
That makes sense. It's like having a set of tools you can always rely on no matter what the conversation throws your way.
Precisely. So I encourage learners to focus on mastering these phrases. Practice saying them out loud in different contexts until they feel natural and effortless.
So it's not just about knowing the words, but really owning them, making them part of your active vocabulary?
Exactly. It's about being able to use these phrases without hesitation, without having to think too hard. And that kind of fluency comes with practice and repetition.
Got it. So focus on those everyday phrases, practice them until they feel like second nature. What other tips do you have for making the most of our speaking practice?
Another simple but effective technique is recording yourself speaking.
You mean like talking into my phone? I do that all the time, but usually it's just me complaining about the traffic.
Well, next time, try recording yourself speaking English. Maybe choose a topic you're interested in or even read a short article aloud. Then listen back to the recording and pay attention to your pronunciation, fluency, and overall clarity.
That's a great idea. That's like having your own personal language coach in your pocket.
Exactly, and it can be really eye-opening. You might be surprised by what you hear, both good and bad.
I can imagine. It's like seeing yourself from a different perspective. What kind of things should I be listening for when I review these recordings?
Well, first, pay attention to your pronunciation. Are you pronouncing words clearly and correctly? If not, try to identify the specific sounds you're struggling with and practice them in isolation.
Okay, so pinpoint those tricky sounds and work on them specifically. What else?
Next, focus on your fluency. Are you speaking smoothly and confidently, or are you hesitating a lot and searching for words? If you're stumbling, try to practice those phrases or sentences more until they flow more naturally.
So it's about identifying those areas where I'm getting stuck and smoothing them out with more practice.
Precisely. And don't be afraid to experiment. Try different intonations, different speeds, different ways of expressing yourself.
It's about playing with the language and finding what feels most comfortable and natural for me.
Exactly. The more you experiment, the more confident and expressive you'll become as a speaker.
This is all so helpful. I feel like we're giving our listeners a real toolbox for improving their speaking skills.
I hope so. And remember, the most important thing is to be consistent with your practice. Even a few minutes each day can make a huge difference over time.
Consistency is key. Now, before we wrap up this part of our chat, I want to touch on a few key vocabulary words that we've been using.
Great idea. Vocabulary is the foundation of any language.
First up, we have the word fluent. It seems like everyone wants to be fluent in English, but what does that really mean?
Well, fluency is about being able to communicate your ideas smoothly and effortlessly without having to pause or search for words. It's about feeling comfortable and confident in your ability to express yourself in English.
So it's not just about knowing a lot of words, but being able to use them effectively in real-time conversation.
Exactly. It's about having that natural flow of language where you can speak without having to overthink every word or grammar rule.
That makes sense. And it sounds like achieving fluency is a journey, not a destination.
Absolutely. It's a process of continuous learning and improvement.
Well, this has been so insightful. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the importance of thinking in English to embracing mistakes and using techniques like shadowing to build fluency. I'm already feeling more motivated to practice.
That's great to hear. And remember, the most important thing is to enjoy the journey. Learning English should be fun and rewarding. So find what works for you and keep practicing.
Great advice. We'll be back soon with part 2 of this episode, where we'll dive even deeper into practical tips and strategies for improving your English speaking skills. Until then, keep practicing and stay motivated. Welcome back to the Daily English Podcast. We're continuing our conversation about making that leap from understanding English to speaking it confidently.
And in the last part, we talked about some really important foundational concepts like thinking directly in English and embracing those inevitable mistakes as part of the learning process.
Exactly. And we also touched on some really cool techniques like shadowing, which I'm personally excited to try out.
It's a game changer. But today I wanted to dig a little deeper into the why behind this struggle, because you're right, is a leap, and understanding the brain science behind it can help us approach the challenge more strategically.
Okay, I'm all ears. Brain science, this is getting interesting.
So when we learn a new language, it's not just about memorizing words and grammar rules. It's about rewiring our brains to process and produce that language.
Rewiring our brains, that sounds intense.
It's not as scary as it sounds. Think about it like this. Your brain has these incredible networks of neurons, and every time you learn something new, you're essentially strengthening those connections or forging new pathways.
Okay, so learning a language is like building new roads in our brains, connecting different areas that handle things like vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation.
Precisely. And when it comes to speaking, there's this fascinating area of the brain called Broca's area, which plays a key role in speech production.
Broca's area. So this is where our thoughts get transformed into spoken words.
Exactly. And the thing is, Broca's area needs to be trained specifically for the language you're learning. Just understanding English doesn't automatically activate those neural pathways in the same way that speaking does.
That makes a lot of sense. So even if I can understand spoken English, my brain still needs specific trainings to produce those sounds and sentences.
Exactly. It's like having all the ingredients for a delicious cake but not knowing how to bake it. You need the recipe and the practice to transform those ingredients into something amazing.
Okay, I love that analogy.
Mhm.
So we need to train our brains to bake spoken English. But I know that for many learners, there's this mental block when it comes to speaking. It's like their brains know the words, but their mouths just won't cooperate.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the psychological aspect of language learning comes in. Because it's not just about the mechanics of speech production, it's also about overcoming those mental barriers.
Mental barriers, like what?
Well, one big one is the fear of judgment. Many learners are afraid of making mistakes, of sounding silly, or of being misunderstood.
Oh, definitely. I think that fear holds so many people back from actually opening their mouths and practicing.
It's totally understandable, but here's the thing. Those fears are often amplified in our own minds. We tend to be much harder on ourselves than others are.
That's so true. We overthink and overanalyze every little mistake, which can make the whole speaking experience feel really intimidating.
Exactly. So one of the keys to overcoming this mental block is to shift our perspective. We need to be kinder to ourselves and embrace those mistakes as part of the learning process.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to stumble and sound imperfect.
Absolutely. Think about it. When a baby is learning to walk, they fall down countless times, but they don't give up. They keep getting up and trying again.
And eventually they're running marathons. So we need to approach language learning with that same kind of resilience and self-compassion.
Exactly. It's about celebrating those small wins, those moments when we push past our comfort zones and try something new, even if it doesn't come out perfectly.
I love that. It's about focusing on the progress, not the perfection.
Precisely. And the more we practice, the more confident we'll become, and the less those mental barriers will hold us back.
Now, we've talked about training our brains for speaking and overcoming those mental blocks. But are there any specific techniques or exercises that you find helpful for actually getting those words flowing more naturally?
Oh, absolutely. There are tons of fun and effective techniques out there, but one that I found particularly helpful, especially for learners who struggle with hesitancy, is something called chunking.
Chunking. What's that?
It's a technique where you break down sentences or phrases into smaller, more manageable chunks. Instead of trying to memorize or produce a whole sentence at once, you focus on mastering those smaller pieces first.
Okay, so instead of trying to say, I would like to order a cup of coffee, please, all in one go, I might break it down into, I would like to order a cup of coffee, please.
Exactly. You're essentially creating building blocks that you can then put together to form more complex sentences.
So it's like building a tower with Lego bricks. You start with those smaller pieces and gradually build up to something bigger and more impressive.
That's a great way to put it. And the beauty of chunking is that it helps reduce cognitive overload. When you're focusing on those smaller chunks, it feels less overwhelming, and you're more likely to speak with fluency and confidence.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about breaking down the complexity of language into bite-sized pieces that our brains can process more easily.
Precisely. And the more you practice chunking, the more natural it will become to string those chunks together into longer, more fluent sentences.
I can already see how this would be helpful, especially for learners who feel intimidated by speaking in complete sentences.
Absolutely. It's a great way to build confidence and reduce anxiety.
So we've talked about chunking, but I know there's another technique that you're a big fan of, shadowing.
Ah, yes. Shadowing is like a secret weapon for language learning. It's one of the most effective ways to improve your pronunciation, intonation, and overall fluency.
We touched on it briefly in the last part, but could you remind us how it works?
Sure. It's really simple. You find a piece of audio or video in English, something you enjoy listening to, and you try to speak along with the speaker, mimicking their pronunciation and rhythm as closely as possible.
So like having a real-time conversation partner, even if it's just with a recording.
Exactly. And the key is to really focus on those details. Notice how the speaker pronounces certain words, where they put the stress, and how their intonation changes throughout the sentence.
So it's not just about repeating the words, but really trying to embody their way of speaking.
Precisely. The more you pay attention to those subtle nuances, the more natural your own spoken English will sound.
I'm definitely going to try this. It sounds like a fun and engaging way to practice. Any tips for making shadowing more effective?
One tip is to choose material that's slightly above your current level. You want it to be challenging, but not so difficult that you get discouraged.
Okay, so something that stretches my abilities but doesn't feel completely overwhelming. What else?
Another tip is to break down the material into smaller chunks. You don't need to shadow an entire movie or podcast episode at once. Start with a few sentences or a short paragraph and gradually work your way up to longer segments.
So start small and build up gradually. That seems to be a recurring theme in language learning.
It's true. Consistency and gradual progress are key. And one more tip for shadowing. Don't be afraid to record yourself and listen back. It can be really helpful to hear how you sound and identify areas where you can improve.
That's a great idea. It's like having your own personal language coach in your pocket.
Exactly. And the more you practice shadowing, the more you'll start to internalize those sounds and rhythms of English, and the more natural your own speaking will become.
This is also helpful. I'm already feeling more motivated to practice my speaking skills, but I know that for many learners, speaking in real-life situations can still feel intimidating.
Absolutely. Stepping outside of your comfort zone and speaking English in the real world can be nerve-wracking, but it's also one of the most rewarding aspects of language learning.
So how can we bridge that gap between practicing in isolation and actually using our speaking skills in real-life conversations?
Well, one of the best ways is to create opportunities for meaningful interaction in English. And that doesn't necessarily mean traveling to an English-speaking country. There are plenty of ways to do this right where you are.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, think about your hobbies and interests. Are there any groups or activities in your community where you could use English?
So if I love to cook, maybe I could join a cooking class taught in English. Or if I'm a movie buff, I could join a film discussion group.
Exactly. It's about finding those natural contexts where you can practice your speaking skills in a way that's fun and engaging.
That makes so much sense. It's about connecting your passion with your language learning goals. What other options are there for finding speaking opportunities?
Well, in this digital age, we have access to a whole world of language learning resources online. Have you ever tried language exchange apps or websites?
I've heard of them, but I've never actually used one. How do they work?
They're essentially platforms where you can connect with other language learners from around the world. You can find a partner who's learning your native language, and you can both help each other practice.
So I could connect with someone who's learning, say, Spanish, and we could spend some time speaking in English, then switch to Spanish.
Exactly. It's a great way to get real-life conversation practice, learn about different cultures, and make new friends along the way.
That sounds fantastic. I'm definitely going to check out those language exchange platforms.
I highly recommend it. And there are tons of other online resources you can explore, online conversation groups, virtual language cafes, even online tutoring sessions with native speakers.
Wow, there's a whole world of possibilities out there. And I think the key takeaway here is that we don't have to wait until we're fluent to start speaking.
You're absolutely right. The sooner you start speaking, even if it's just a few words or simple phrases, the faster you'll progress.
It's about taking those small steps, embracing those mistakes, and finding those opportunities for meaningful interaction.
Precisely. And remember, the journey of language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. So be patient with yourself, celebrate those small wins, and most importantly, have fun along the way.
Great advice. We've covered so much ground in this part of our conversation, from the brain science behind speaking to finding real-life opportunities to practice. I'm feeling super inspired to keep pushing forward on my own language learning journey.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There are millions of English learners around the world facing the same challenges and celebrating those same victories.
That's a great reminder. We're all in this together. We'll be back soon with the final part of this episode where we'll wrap up our conversation and leave you with some final thoughts and motivation to keep practicing your English speaking skills.
Until then, keep those words flowing.
Welcome back to the Daily English Podcast. It's been an amazing journey exploring the ups and downs of speaking English, hasn't it?
It really has. We've covered so much ground from understanding the brain science behind speaking to overcoming those mental barriers and finding practical techniques to boost fluency.
And, through all these conversations, I keep coming back to one central theme, the power of mindset.
Absolutely. Your mindset plays a huge role in your language learning success. It's about how you approach challenges, how you view mistakes, and how you stay motivated even when things get tough.
So it's not just about the techniques and strategies, but about cultivating that inner belief in yourself and your ability to learn.
Precisely. And one of the most important aspects of mindset is setting realistic expectations. Because let's face it, learning a new language takes time and effort. It's not a quick fix.
It's like trying to build a skyscraper overnight.
Yeah,
It's just not going to happen.
exactly. And when we set unrealistic expectations like, I want to be fluent in 3 miles, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and frustration.
So it's about finding that balance between ambition and patience. We want to challenge ourselves, but we also need to be kind to ourselves and acknowledge that progress takes time.
Precisely. And I think it's also important to define what fluency means to you personally, because fluency isn't just about speaking perfectly or sounding like a native speaker. It's about being able to communicate effectively and confidently in different situations.
So it's about setting those personal goals that align with our own motivations for learning English.
Exactly. If you're learning English to travel, your definition of fluency might be being able to order food, ask for directions, and have basic conversations with locals. But if you're aiming to work in an English-speaking environment, your fluency goals might be much higher.
That makes sense. It's about tailoring our approach to our own individual needs and aspirations.
And one of the most effective ways to cultivate a growth mindset is to focus on those small wins, those moments of progress that keep you motivated.
So instead of dwelling on what I still don't know, I should celebrate how far I've come.
Absolutely. Every time you learn a new word, understand a complex sentence, or have a successful conversation in English, acknowledge that progress. Give yourself credit for those small victories.
That's a great reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the challenges and forget to appreciate how much we've already learned.
It's so true. And those small wins, those moments of accomplishment are what fuel our motivation and keep us moving forward on this language learning journey.
So it's not just about the end goal, but about enjoying the process and celebrating those milestones along the way.
Exactly. And another important aspect of mindset is resilience. Because let's be honest, there will be times when you feel frustrated, discouraged, or even tempted to give up.
Those moments when you feel like you're hitting a wall, and no matter how much you practice, you're just not making progress.
It happens to all of us. But the key is to not let those setbacks define you. It's about bouncing back, learning from those challenges, and finding ways to overcome them.
So it's about having that grit, that determination to keep going, even when it's tough.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to build resilience is to surround yourself with a supportive community. Find language learning partners, join online forums or groups, connect with other learners who understand your struggles and can cheer you on.
That makes so much sense. It's like having a cheering section to help you stay motivated and accountable.
Precisely. And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There are millions of English learners around the world facing the same challenges and celebrating those same victories.
That's a great reminder. We're all in this together.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful tools for cultivating a positive mindset is gratitude.
Gratitude.
Mm.
How does that apply to language learning?
Well, when we practice gratitude, we shift our focus from what we lack to what we already have. And in the context of language learning, there's always something to be grateful for.
Like the fact that we have access to so many amazing resources, online courses, language exchange apps, podcasts like this one.
Exactly. And even if you're just starting out, you can be grateful for the opportunity to learn a new language, to connect with different cultures, and to expand your horizons.
That's a beautiful perspective.
Mm.
It's about appreciating the journey, not just the destination.
And when we approach language learning with that sense of gratitude, we're more likely to enjoy the process, to stay motivated, and to persevere even when challenges arise.
Well, this has been such an inspiring conversation. We've covered so much ground in these three parts, from the practical techniques to the power of mindset and the importance of community.
I hope our listeners are feeling energized and ready to take their English-speaking skills to the next level.
Me too. And to all of our amazing listeners out there, remember, speaking English is a skill that can be learned and improved with practice, dedication, and a positive mindset. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, embrace those challenges, and celebrate those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. And remember, we're here to support you on your language learning journey.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more helpful tips and strategies. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends who are also learning English. Until next time, happy learning.